Hello, thank you for joining us for this session, Zero Net Carbon Schools webinar. This session is being produced with the City of San Jose Environmental Services and the Silicon Valley Energy Watch. I am Connie Umfris, Communications Manager here at New Buildings Institute. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping things to tell you about. First, you are muted and we cannot hear you. This helps keep the background noise down so that everyone can better hear the speakers. I want to direct you to the dashboard that you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you are having technical difficulties and cannot see the slides or hear our speakers, you can use this question pane to let us know and we will help you as we go. We will take a few questions at the end of the presentation. Please ask the questions in the same question pane. Please take a couple minutes to answer the survey that will pop up after the session. If you are seeking AIA credit, this is where you will enter your AIA number. This session is being recorded. All registrants will receive an email tomorrow with links to the recording and slides for this session. Kicking off today's webinar is Amy Cortez, NBI Project Director. Amy has been involved in sustainable design consulting and implementation of energy efficiency market transformation approaches for over 20 years. She is responsible for managing implementation teams covering all aspects of NBI's work, including the work around educational facilities, getting educational facilities to zero energy and zero carbon. Over to you, Amy.
Hi, thanks, Connie. Thanks, everyone. We're really glad that you're able to be here today, and we hope that you're all well and safe and healthy. Appreciate you taking the time to learn a little bit more about Zero Net Carbon Schools. We're really excited to share some information with you today. And we can go ahead and advance the slide. So this training is brought to you in partnership with Silicon Valley Energy Watch. And so I'd like to begin by welcoming Tina Gonterman. She's with the City of San Jose and the Environmental Services Department and with Silicon Valley Energy Watch. So Tina, you want to give us a little intro to SVEW?
Sure, thanks so much, Amy and Connie. I am part of the Silicon Valley Energy Watch, or SVU, and we are a local government partnership administered by the City of San Jose and working with PG&E. And our main focus is energy efficiency of buildings. And for right now and for the last little bit, we've been focusing on the public sector buildings, energy efficiency with public sector. But we've in the past had a variety of programs focusing on residential, commercial, you name it, we've tried it. So we're extremely happy to be making this webinar happen today and to bring more ideas and tips and specifically the schools helping to guide toward the pathway of zero. Next slide, please. So this is a screenshot of a video that SVU created about a year ago. It's called Zero Net Carbon Buildings. It's on our website, and we will send a link to this video today or tomorrow to everyone registered. The reason why I'm calling this video out is it talks through the main concepts of what zero net carbon buildings are, and it actually calls out schools. In fact, that screenshot right there is a video, a drone video screenshot of one of the schools here in San Jose that is zero net carbon. So I encourage you to look at that link. It's 3 minutes or less. It's a great overview. Share it with your stakeholders. It's even appropriate for students. But lastly, what I wanted to share is the purpose of us making this video was to make sure that our partner organizations had access to it, and even more so to make it their own. There's a last slide or last frame of the video, and it has a logo for the City of San Jose as well as a URL, and we can make it possible so any of you on this call, any partner, any organization, any school, district, whatnot, can have access to that last frame and you can put your own logo and URL in there and basically use it however you'd like. So we'll send more information about this after, including what to do if you are interested in this opportunity. So you can look forward to that.
Great.
All right, so we do have some other opportunities coming up with SVU, Silicon Valley Energy Watch, and wanted to call them out. One is a webinar on April 21st called Energy and Water Efficient Cafeterias. That is mainly going to be focusing on school cafeterias, school kitchens, etc. So I encourage all of you to participate in that as well. The link at the bottom, sgenvironment.org/energy trainings, has all of this information, how to register, the time, etc. So, and again, you'll get these slides and access to all of this information later, so you don't have to worry about registering right now. For the in-person events that you see listed here, there are 3 coming up in May and June. Now, I will say that given yesterday's new guidance to continue the shutdown, and I'm hearing also that schools might be closing for the rest of the year, these 2 factors may change if, you know, this in-person plan. We may try to do them as webinars or may reschedule or have to cancel. So at this point, as of today, you can go on and register as if they're going to happen. And what will happen is myself, will reach out to you and let you know what the plan is if we need to change that. All right, well, thanks so much. It's back to you, Amy.
Great, thank you, Tina. All right, so those of you who are familiar, New Buildings Institute is a national nonprofit that works to reduce energy and carbon emissions in the building sector. And if you want to flip to the next slide, this session will be eligible for a continuing education credits through AIA. And we're at the end of this, we're hoping you understand a little bit more about the current status and the approaches that districts have used to get to zero energy and zero carbon. We also want to connect you with some resources. Next. So getting to zero in schools is really about, we're starting to see students starting to really demand climate action. And there are a lot of students that are very interested in understanding how to address carbon emissions. Next slide. And we think that getting to zero schools is a really tangible way to kind of connect these students with activities literally in their own schoolyard. But there are a lot of reasons, in addition to the students' interest, to really help pursue these aggressive goals of getting to zero. One is, you know, utility bills are often one of the largest expenses associated with districts behind teacher salaries. And so there's an opportunity for the cost avoidance. But the other thing we know is that healthy, productive, well-ventilated schools provide comfortable and productive learning environments. We have research that suggests that students' test scores improve faster, there's less absenteeism, and it really has a lot to do with the fact that students spend more than 1,000 hours in a typical school year in their school building. There also aligns with 21st century learning opportunities, and as we're seeing, schools really are kind of a hub in our communities. So making sure that schools are able to continue to operate really does result in stronger, more resilient communities. Next. At MBI, we have been studying zero energy buildings, and schools are an important part of that. But we've been studying these for, about 8 years. We've been publishing a list, and this, we now have over 600 buildings on the list, and it provides a way for us to understand commonalities and patterns that these buildings have that are a little bit different from conventional buildings. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about the process that some of these buildings use. Next. What we know about our Getting to Zero list is that schools are absolutely leading. More than a third of the buildings on the list are educational facilities, but they're not all full, K-12 schools. Sometimes they're higher education. We also see things like a science lab or a library associated with the school. But we do know that early schools are early adopters. They were in the green building movement, and now in this evolution towards zero energy and zero carbon, they're leading as well. We also know that there are school buildings in pretty much every climate zone across the United States. So it is not just for a particular climate where zero energy schools are possible, but certainly California is leading with advanced policies and talk of zero energy for a decade now. There are about 80 buildings, 80 school facilities in California that are pursuing zero energy. Next. So when we talk about getting to zero, it is really important to clarify the terminology, right? In California, it's ZNE, other places it's NZE. But it's also important to understand, are we talking about site energy if we're talking about zero energy? And that's just the energy, the bills, basically that's represented on utility bills. But if you're talking about source energy, that takes into account transmission and distribution losses. And typically source energy is about 3 times the site energy. So it is important to clarify those. But definitions also have to be careful to clarify whether renewables are provided on-site or how off-site renewables will be calculated to ensure that they're not double counted. The U.S. Department of Energy has separate definitions for buildings, portfolios, or campus. And kind of the last evolution that we've seen, the most recent evolution, is really kind of this transition to zero net carbon. And so what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the difference between carbon and energy. Next slide. Whoops, this, hit it one more time, please. It is important to note that energy and carbon, while they are related, they are not the same. The chart that you see here, we call it a heat map. It has the months across the top and the hours of the day going down. So every little box represents a certain hour at a certain time of year. And what we see here is that the carbon intensity of the grid really depends on that local grid condition and what time it is and what time of year it is. So this is a highly renewable grid where the green represents renewable sources that have a very low carbon input. But you can see that the darker red spaces really show times where the carbon contribution in electricity is still fairly high, right? So it's important to know that these two things are related, but not the same. Next slide. The other thing that is important to know is that it's kind of a changing equation, right? Because as utilities as renewables are added, especially renewables at the utility scale, it's going to continue to change the carbon intensity of that grid over time. Next slide. So an example of this is shown in these two separate heat maps, one for a grid in 2020 now, and another for a predicted grid in 2030 if all the renewable portfolio standards are all purchased out and the utilities do add the renewables as required. So you see that in the top graph, the red is replaced with black, and there's a fair amount of time where there's still a heavy carbon intensity of the grid. And that will change over time. So this is going to continue to evolve, and it's going to be a very dynamic thing. But what we understand and what research has consistently supported is that energy efficiency continues to be a very cost-effective strategy that should be pursued in buildings. And that's because, one, it makes the cost of renewables less, right? Because you have to purchase less renewables. But also because of what in the kind of utility efficiency industry has been called non-energy benefits. And in reality, those are the things that schools care about, right? Healthy, productive environments. And we know that with efficiency goals, we can help achieve highly productive and spaces that benefit students and teachers, improve the quality of that built environment while saving energy. So efficiency is going to continue, even if the grid is decarbonizing. It's important to know that efficiency has all these other benefits that we need to continue to think about. Next slide. So that was thinking about the fuel consumption on the electricity side. But as we transition this conversation from kind of zero energy, thinking about all fuels, to thinking about zero carbon, we want to think about the use of natural gas in buildings. So that's an important thing to consider. And natural gas is primarily used in heating, hot water heating, and where it's used depends on where you are in the country, and because it does vary by place. Next slide. And in schools, if you think about where gas is used in schools, it is a lot in boiler systems and heating, space heating, but we also see natural gas use in kitchens. And that's another primary use that has to be considered in school districts. Next slide. So we wanted to take a quick look at some codes and policies in California that are really driving towards this decarbonization. California has a goal to decarbonize the building sector, and that goal is coming up pretty quickly. Next slide. They started back in 2008 with the California Energy Efficiency Strategic Plan, which really set out goals to have all new residential zero energy by 2020, new commercial by 2030, and half of existing buildings being zero energy by 2030. Next slide. And to the California Energy Commission's credit, they set out the goal in 2008, and lo and behold, last year or this year, residential Title 24 really did take the residential energy code and require zero energy. And they're marching along on this path to improve the energy code every 3 years until it does achieve zero energy. But like I said, energy and carbon are somewhat are related, but not the same. So there are other cities, there are specific cities within California who are moving even beyond Title 24. And I've invited Sean Dennison, from Senior Project Manager from New Buildings Institute, to talk a little bit about the San Jose REACH code, the electrification REACH code, that does have requirements that will impact new school construction. In fact, all new construction, but it's important to note that some of the things he's going to talk about are really only about new construction. So Sean, I'm going to pass it off.
All right, thank you, Amy. So we're going to talk about San Jose's electrification REACH code. And what this is a REACH code is a code that sits above the base code, in this case, Title 24. And it includes a set of requirements that go beyond that code, but they are still requirements. Everyone needs to do them. And in San Jose, the electrification REACH code is really a policy that's partnered to something else that San Jose is doing. It's called a community choice aggregator, But really what it means is that all of the electricity that is provided to San Jose this year will be from carbon-free sources. So that means that all the electricity has been rapidly and drastically reduced in its carbon consumption, leaving the only carbon consumption in buildings in San Jose coming from natural gas. So the REACH code is looking beyond efficiency, and it's looking really at getting buildings to go all electric to leverage that carbon-free electricity that's available in San Jose. I want to make a couple of points about the REACH code. There are a whole bunch of requirements in the REACH code that apply to all building types. So there are some requirements in the REACH code that maybe you've heard about that won't be applying to schools. We're only going to talk about what applies to schools today. And then the other thing to note is that the REACH code only applies to new buildings. So not just new constructions or alterations on existing buildings, those aren't under it. It's only new buildings. You don't need to worry about this if you're doing renovations or retrofits, even major renovations to schools, only new buildings. So the REACH code has three primary components. The first one is building electrification. The second is electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And then the third is solar readiness. And these three pieces working together are meant to decarbonize both buildings and transportation in San Jose. So let's start with building electrification. I'm sure many of you know that if you're building a new school, there are two ways that you can comply with Title 24. One is modeled compliance, and this is where you put all of your building features into a piece of software and it models the performance, it checks it against a benchmark, and you either comply with the code or you don't comply based on the overall compliance, the overall energy performance of the building. This is a very flexible way to get through code compliance, and most new buildings in California comply with Title 24 this way. The other path is called the prescriptive compliance approach, and this is really just a checklist. It gives you a list of building features, you put all these building features into your building, and you comply with the code. It's a simpler approach, but it's a lot less flexible, which is why fewer buildings do that in California. So in the REACH code, there are compliance paths for both modeled compliance and prescriptive compliance. And for a school, if a school is going to be all electric, then it just meets Title 24, and it's done with this part of the REACH code. It meets the building electrification requirements, and that's it. But if you want to have a mixed fuel building, a mixed fuel school in San Jose, then you have to do two things. You have to have greater efficiency than Title 24, and you have to have what's called electrification readiness, which we'll talk about in a moment. Starting with the greater efficiency, for a modeled compliance building, they have to be 6% better than Title 24. And if they're going through prescriptive compliance, there's a whole list of additional things that will need to be done in addition to Title 24, in addition to the energy code. So even though most buildings go through modeled performance path, I think it's worthwhile to look at the list of things that are included in the prescriptive path, because they kind of give you the kind of features that might be included in your building, even if you're modeling. And really what we're looking at is it's a better envelope, it's a better HVAC system, it's looking at including things like drain water heat recovery, improved controls. So it really is just stepping up all kinds of building features. So in addition to the efficiency, a mixed fuel building would also need to be electrification ready. And really what this means is that everywhere there is gas equipment, there also needs to be the electrical wiring to replace that gas equipment with electric equipment. So here are two examples. These are from what you might see for a dryer, which you're probably not going to see much of in schools, but this is a good illustrative example. You have the gas line for the gas dryer, and then you have the plug with a circuit that goes all the way back to the electrical panel and all of the capacity at the electrical panel. So this is enough electricity available to power an electric dryer in the future. This would apply to all kinds of gas loads, whether they're cooking, water heating, space heating, that all of these would have to have the electrical infrastructure in the building, the wiring, the capacity available to replace that gas equipment with electric in the future. So you can see how these two pieces together, both the efficiency and the electrification readiness, give a really strong incentive to buildings to go ahead and electrify. And in the case of schools in San Jose, electrification is actually fairly straightforward because most of the loads in schools are relatively straightforward to electrify. And in most cases, and schools are one of these cases, it's actually cheaper to build an all-electric building than it is to build a mixed fuel building, because once you take out those gas end uses, you can take out all that gas piping and that gas hookup, which means tremendous amount of cost savings upfront for schools under construction. Now, the next part of the electrification reach code is the electric vehicle charging infrastructure requirements. Now, again, these only apply to new buildings. So if you're doing a renovation in your parking lot, you might want to think about this, but you're not going to be required to do this in your parking lot. Now, to talk about the requirements that are in the REACH code, we have to do a little bit of terminology first, because there are different kinds of electric vehicle spaces, and these are really meant to serve different purposes. The first kind is called an EV capable space. And this is really just conduit that goes from the space to the electrical panel and a little bit of electrical capacity reserved at the panel. This is a really forward-thinking requirement, that this is to avoid the future costs of, a lot of the future costs of an EV retrofit. Because if you think about adding electric vehicle charging to an existing parking lot, the biggest expense is actually retrenching the parking lot, tearing through your asphalt, digging trenches, and laying the conduit, putting everything back afterwards. So EV capable spaces are really looking at the future. The second type of EV space is called an EV ready space. This has the actual wiring between the panel and the parking space. It terminates in either a junction box or a plug. And there's, again, the capacity at the panel is reserved so that the charging can take place in the future. This would allow someone to come in with their own portable EV charger and plug it in. This is something that we see mostly in residential. This is not something that schools are really going to need to be concerned with. The last type is called EV supply equipment spaces. The supply equipment is the actual charger. You can't plug a EV straight into the grid. You have to have a charger. And in most commercial spaces, in most parking lots, that charger is then provided at the parking space. People at home will have a charger at their home. So in the case of an EVSE, an electric vehicle supply equipment space, it has everything that's required for a car to actually pull in and charge. It's got the wiring, it has the electrical capacity, and it has the actual charger. In the case of schools, new schools, there would have already been some requirements for EV charging in the base code, even without the REACH code. But the REACH code ups that number of spaces. And this is in part because of San Jose's goals for decarbonizing the transportation sector, but it's also to respond to the market, because San Jose has the highest sales of electric vehicles in the country. If you look at a per capita basis, it has a really high penetration of EVs already. So the requirements for schools would be that 10% of the spaces in the parking lot would need to be EVSE spaces, electric vehicle supply equipment spaces, everything needed to charge a car. And then 40% would need to be EV capable, just the conduit in the ground. So you can see that there's immediate infrastructure available for charging cars today, and then setting the stage to make low-cost retrofits in the future to expand the number of spaces where EVs can pull in and charge. And then the third part of the REACH code is called solar readiness. Now, Title 24 already has a set of solar readiness requirements, and these really make sure that a building is capable and all completely ready to have photovoltaic systems installed in the future. There's a minimum requirement for how big of a zone has to be free on the roof for a future photovoltaic installation, a requirement for conduit between that area and the main panel, And it has requirements for the minimum size, the minimum amount of area that's available for photovoltaics, and then the minimum size that each piece of that area has to be. There's no point in having area available if it's not big enough to actually put some panels on. Or a building can just install a PV system. And like I said, this is already a part of Title 24 for most buildings, but not all buildings. And what the San Jose REACH code does is make this a requirement for all buildings. And how this will impact schools really depends. Schools that were 3 stories or below already fell under the Title 24 requirements for solar readiness zone. So those schools aren't going to see any difference under the REACH code. However, the REACH code does expand the requirement to any schools that are 4 stories or taller. Now, these don't happen very often, but they do exist. So if you are planning on building a taller school, a 4-story or taller school, then it would have to have a solar readiness zone under the REACH code when it wouldn't have under Title 24. So those are the 3 components of the San Jose REACH code: building electrification, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and this expanded solar readiness. And just as a reminder, these only apply to new schools being built. They won't apply to retrofits. But even if you're doing a retrofit, you might think about these requirements and think about how you might be able to include them in your schools to make them less carbon intensive, but really only required for new schools. And with that, I'll hand it back to Amy.
Thanks, Sean. Okay, so with that quick intro to what the electrification REACH code is in San Jose, we're going to talk a little bit about the process that school districts are taking to get to zero over time. So Rocky Mountain Institute dubbed this idea of zero over time, and really what they're talking about is this long-term strategic approach to energy management, one that sets measurable goals and then establishes policies and policy guidance documents to help achieve those goals. And we also know that in schools, it's really important to dovetail this long-term strategic plan with the focus on the benefits to the learning environment. Because I know it seems obvious to say, but schools are about educating students. So we need to make sure that any work we're interested in doing to improve the energy performance, the carbon emissions reduction, that has to be integrated into the improvements to the learning environment. Next slide. We have learned in our research that every project, every successful district has a champion. It is one commonality of all the zero energy projects that we know about. Oftentimes the zero hero, if you will, is on staff, but it doesn't have to be on staff. It can be a trusted consultant, whether that's a construction project manager or an architect, but we do know that there's someone there, and that someone is there to help establish goals and then to kind of defend those goals and make sure that they're being considered all along the process. When we started doing this work, it was thinking about it one building at a time. And what's different about getting to zero over time is really thinking about the entire portfolio and how that portfolio, decisions that are made across the portfolio are dovetailing with the energy and carbon goals. So in districts, we're seeing that the Zero Hero is responsible for developing policies that support the goals. And then they're there to help make sure those policies are being implemented. And then the exciting thing is we're starting to see more sustainability folks in schools that are tied both to the energy performance of the buildings, but also back to education, trying to get some of this information back into the schools. So gaining support is really the responsibility of the champion. It's not their sole responsibility, but it does seem to be that the champion is a little bit of a cheerleader to help make sure energy and sustainability is considered at the right time. So their role is to help incorporate energy into this process. Like I said, improvements to school buildings happen primarily for educational purposes. And so getting a seat at the table, the sustainability or energy manager can really help dovetail those energy goals into there. One of the things that we've seen with successful districts is that they find a really critical part of their work is developing trust with other groups within the school district. So, for example, the facilities and grounds group and the design and capital construction group. You know, there is an important role for the sustainability people to play, and part of it is making sure that they're listening to these folks and understanding where their concerns are, you know, because if you think about across an entire district's portfolio, it's going to take a lot of people to implement these goals successfully, and so you need to understand what the challenges are so that you can help develop plans to overcome them. We've seen sustainability or energy managers or the Zero champion as the one who finds synergy with other projects. Like, oh, that's happening. We can integrate improved energy performance, or that's an opportunity to reduce carbon emissions. That's an important thing. And then the other thing that the ones that we've been talking to suggest is capitalize on low-hanging fruit. You know, things that are easy are a way to kind of develop a track record and demonstrate success and show how this can work. So finding those low-hanging fruit, those early projects that you can implement are really helpful. The goals are often set at a district level. And so I put some examples here. They might be about energy consumption reduction. They might talk explicitly about a carbon reduction goal or renewable energy generation. But the other one that we see often is to have an average portfolio energy use intensity. We'll talk a little bit about what EUI is, but having specific energy targets for specific buildings certainly helps. Next slide. Typically, the goals and actually the entire process on how to integrate energy and carbon reductions is most often aligned with a building life cycle. So if you think about Zero over time and you think about a building and all the opportunities you have to influence the energy or carbon emissions, there are only certain points in that building where it makes sense, right? New construction is an obvious one. Major modernizations when you're going in there and making changes anyway. A system retrofit or an equipment when it breaks down and has to be replaced. Those are the times where you want to incorporate energy and carbon into the goals and into the entire process. Next slide. So at each life cycle event, obviously the comfort, health, thermal, comfort, acoustic, all those considerations should be paramount. We want to make sure schools are adequately ventilated and that students are in a comfortable, productive space. But making sure that the goals are known by everybody who's involved in that particular project, focusing on ways to reduce energy loads within the building, and then really paying attention to the carbon intensity of the equipment that's selected. That's something that's going to be really important. And then investigating electric vehicle integration, and there are electric vehicle bus programs in California, and photovoltaics and renewables. Goals setting, like I said, having on a particular project an energy use intensity target. EUI is often measured in kilobtu per square foot per year. There's been a lot of research that sets energy use intensity targets for new school construction. And in the San Jose area, we're seeing these EUI targets the site EUI targets be about 17 kilobtu per square foot per year. Next slide. This is actually dovetails really nicely with the data set that NBI maintains, the Getting to Zero database, where we see the median educational buildings, the median site EUI coming in right around that. So we know that this is possible. All those green dots are measured values. So while it seems it seems like a very ambitious goal. I'm here to tell you that it is very achievable, and and when considered early, it can be done very cost effectively as well. Next slide. School renovation targets, again, the second use case, major modernization. Their EUI targets may not be able to be as aggressive as the new construction. Obviously, you have an existing building shell, and there may be challenges associated with, making sure that shell is airtight, and other challenges in renovations or major modernizations that may make it a little bit more difficult. However, if it's really a major modernization and they're changing everything, I will say it looks a lot more like a new construction than it does a modernization where the existing shell and all the challenges that might have are continued. Next slide. So what we see in these successful districts is they have goals and they have policies. Usually the policies are instituted at the board level. But then they have guidance documents that help support the implementation of those policies. So an example is an owner's program requirements. So an OPR is a narrative explanation of what a school district is looking for in new school construction. And this is a place where you can use those EUI targets that we were talking about to have an explicit EUI target for whether it's new construction or major modernization. You can put that right in the owner's program requirements. So that's a really important policy guidance tool. There are also just contractual documents, requests for proposals. When they go out with an EUI target, we see districts say, oh, we're interested in LEED Gold with an EUI of 18. So that's a way that you can incorporate this and make sure the design teams are on notice that energy and carbon reductions are a key part of strategies going forward. Tech specs are another set of documents that defines what types of equipment is acceptable within school district portfolios. And if you have a carbon reduction or energy reduction goal, it's really important to make sure those tech specs are updated with kind of the latest equipment or the equipment that the district wants to see in that building, and that make sure that that equipment we know is going to meet the stringent energy performance requirements. Facility master plans is another common one that's used across the district, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. So so we have these goals, and it's important to have those policy guidance documents, but I can tell you that having those isn't necessarily enough. You have to make sure it's actually getting implemented. And so in new construction or anytime an architectural team, architect design, construction teams are selected, an important check-in point is making sure that in the interview process, energy and carbon reductions are considered. NBI has a list of questions that we encourage school districts to ask their prospective design teams, but it's important for them to report on how the buildings that they've built before are performing. And if they don't really know how they're performing, well, maybe that's a sign. Next slide. The sustainability champion should also make sure that the integrated design process is pursued. Often that starts with an early charrette, but that engages perspectives and making sure that this continues all the way through design, through construction. Next slide. We've seen a common menu of technologies that have been implemented to get to a zero energy target, and we have an in-person session scheduled in May which may or may not transition to online. We're going to talk a little bit more about technologies, but this is just a quick list of some ones that we see pretty common in zero energy buildings on our list. Next slide. The sustainability champion or the energy champion really should pay attention to certain key checkpoints throughout the new construction or major renovation process. Making sure there's an early energy model and that it's revised at the end of each phase. That's a really good time for the sustainability champion to double check things are going on, because we know these folks are really busy. They have a lot going on. So we need to establish some key check-in points where they're consulted and they can say, yep, this project's on task. Bring a commissioning agent. The districts that are successful at this, they firmly believe commissioning is well worth the money, and bringing the commissioning agent in during the design phase is really important. And then the other thing that we see about zero energy schools is mock-ups, and making sure that the contractors are doing mock-ups, because there's a lot of different trades that get involved, especially in building envelope construction, and making sure that's done in the right order and done in a very airtight way so that ventilation air can be delivered in an appropriate way is super important. Next slide. There are certain pain points that we know about, sometimes making all this work together, especially complicated controls integration, that can be a challenge. We advocate for a keep it super simple, a KISS approach, where, simplicity is paramount, and making sure people know how to operate and use the building. Value engineering has consistently been a challenge, where first cost reductions don't consider ongoing or life cycle costs. But that's one to pay attention to, and the sustainability champion should certainly be involved. Making the handoff from design and construction through operations is critical. That arc of continuity, and making sure that operators know how to operate new equipment, especially if it's new to them, and that the occupants know how how the building should operate, so that they're doing everything they can to make sure the building's going to achieve its goals. Next slide. So that was a little bit about the process from a new construction and to some extent major modernizations, right? And talking a little bit about how the champion can stay involved in the process and how that might work. I wanted to take a kind of a step back and talk specifically now a little bit about retrofit and modernizations, because one of the things we've learned is that in typical facility assessments, they'll go in and look at the space to understand what's in there from an educational perspective, but may not pay as much attention to the energy attributes of the building. And even if they do look at the systems, they're probably not looking at the building's shell and opportunities associated with that. So we encourage districts during the assessments of existing buildings to really make sure energy is one of the main considerations that is taken in, because if they're walking through that building anyway, that's the time to kind of pay attention to the energy. So these districts know that they need to get beyond like-for-like replacements. So that applies in the system retrofit or the equipment at equipment failure, right? Instead of just going back and getting the same equipment that was in there, that's an opportunity. And these districts are seeing all of these as opportunities to go beyond and improve this like-for-like replacement, because it is clear every decision matters on the path to zero. Next slide. There are documents to guide the retrofit process, some which we've already talked about, but just know that these tech specs or whatnot do influence not only new construction, but also modernizations. But it is important to make sure that assessment reports are there. And then the other thing we recommend is, having sustainability and energy checklists for each of the different types of use cases, whether it's new construction or equipment failure, often because the sustainability people are so busy that they need some clear processes so that they know these things are being implemented appropriately. So checklists are always good. Next slide. Verification and reporting is another commonality of successful districts. Many have an annual reporting to the school board, or at least or publicly reporting, where they'll have a web page where they post information. They typically benchmark to verify the actual outcomes and the energy performance of the buildings, and they compare from year to year across, for all the elementary schools and all the high schools. And some even have visual display and feedback for users. Next slide. But the important thing to know is that involving students is also a really good opportunity, right? Because we are in schools, there is a way to involve students in making sure we get to zero, and that is a way to improve the learning environment and connect students to the energy consumption and the carbon emissions associated with their own school buildings. Next slide. So getting to zero over time, in a quick summary, is really this long-term strategic approach with measurable goals, policies to support it, and then implementation of those policies that leverage every opportunity to improve energy performance. It goes beyond a like-for-like replacement and really tries to focus on improving the quality of the built environment for our students and for the teachers that are occupying these buildings. So we really quickly want to get to some questions. There are lots of resources that are available. We can kind of fly through these. There are resources on the process. Next slide. There's a zero energy process guide that is very helpful, explains a little bit about, this is mostly focused on new construction or major modernizations. The next slide shows the Advanced Energy Design Guide. This is a prescriptive approach for how to achieve zero energy in every climate zone. This is done by ASHRAE. So that's a free download that's available. Next slide. NBI maintains a Getting to Zero Resources Hub, and if you see on the ZE Resources Hub, there's a school section which has a variety of different curated resources. We have sample RFPs, sample owner's project requirements, so that you don't have to create it from scratch. Next slide. NBI has a lot of zero energy case studies about schools. We find that doing tours where you can walk through buildings is an effective way to do it, but if you can't do that, the videos like the one Tina shared and case studies are a good way to help get stakeholder awareness and prove that this is possible. Next slide. There are watch lists. Next slide. That's all our school buildings. If you're looking for another building, we have charrette guides. Next slide. And all of this will be available to you. We'll send out these slides so that you can check this out. So there's lots of resources, zeroenergy.org. Next slide is the Center for Green Schools Learning Lab, and a whole bunch of other resources. So with that, we kind of flew through some of these. I'd like to take a couple questions if we could.
Sure. I've been reviewing everything that's come in. Just a quick note, if you hadn't heard at the beginning, we do send out a follow-up email tomorrow that includes a certificate of attendance and links to both the PDF of the slide presentation and a link to this recording. So you will get all that information tomorrow around this time. So one very popular question today was about embodied carbon. How does embodied carbon fit into this process?
Good question. Embodied carbon is we're actually having a webinar about that this week too. So those of you who are interested in embodied carbon, please go to the NBI events page and you can sign up for an embodied carbon webinar. It's on the books. Embodied carbon is one of what we're calling the 5 foundations of getting to zero carbon. So efficiency, renewables, grid interoperability, fuel site selection, and embodied carbon. So right now, embodied carbon would be a consideration, would be something, it's like a in and of itself.
Oh, Amy.
other web more about that.
Okay. Let's see. Sorry, I lost my spot. What about equipment for a carbon neutral kitchen?
Yeah, that is a good question, and I will refer to the Silicon Valley Energy Watch upcoming webinar. We'll talk a little bit more about equipment selection in kitchen. There are induction cooking methods that are becoming more popular, and one of the things we've learned in schools is that removing things like gas fryers are aligned with health goals. But there is sometimes, there's work that needs to be done to get the kitchen staff comfortable with some of these new or different cooking approaches in schools, but removing gas in schools is something that we're seeing more and more, especially in California. So, but removing that, and often it is because of health goals as well. So there are some resources available about kitchens, and we can connect those two, but I'm going to refer you back to the Silicon Valley Energy Watch, their upcoming webinar about kitchens.
This is Sean. One thing I would add on that is that the critical thing to remember is that the equipment all exists. There are parts of the country where gas actually just isn't an option for their kitchens, and they have all electric kitchens. So it's really not an equipment issue. It's more of a transforming your processes issue. So I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind.
And Tina had a quick last minute plug for her upcoming events. Tina, did you want to say something before we log off here?
Sure, thanks. I just wanted to remind folks to visit the sjeenvironment.gov/energy trainings website. And one of those upcoming trainings, in addition to the one on April 21st, that's a webinar that was just referenced, that's focusing on kitchens in schools, but there is an in-person one still scheduled for May 14th. I encourage all of you, if you're interested in this topic, if you need a refresher of this, if you want to share it with your stakeholders, or you want to dive deeper, that will be a great opportunity. And what I suggest is that you register for that. And the best way to be informed of if it's rescheduled or move to a webinar or whatever it is that we end up doing, if needed, the best way to be informed on that is to register, and we will be in contact with all registrants. And that's it.
Great. Well, we have quite a few other questions, but they're very specific to other people's buildings or processes. And so I am going to pass these questions along to our presenters. And some of the more specific questions will be answered one-on-one from our presenters and our friend Riley, who's also on the line today, who's our project manager for the schools. So we thank you very much for being here with us today. And as Amy said, we do have an embodied carbon webinar tomorrow, same time, 10 o'clock, and it is the link to register is available on the NBI events page. Stay well and let us know if you have any questions after we log off. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone.